blood, billions of dollars, and a ruthless family empire hung in the balance of a single, unyielding titanium lockbox. 25 brilliant minds had walked into this penthouse. 25 walked out defeated. Yet it wasn't a master hacker who cracked it, but a girl holding a feather duster. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago triplex penthouse, blurring the neon skyline into streaks of weeping color. Inside the dimly lit study, the air was thick with the scent of aged scotch, expensive leather, and palpable desperation. Cassius Reed stood by the window, an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth. He was a man carved from cold marble, inheriting a fracturing criminal empire at the age of 32. On the mahogany desk in the center of the room sat the bane of his existence, the Besson cylinder. It wasn't just a safe. It was a custom-engineered nightmare, commissioned by his late predecessor, a paranoid man who trusted no one. The device was a hybrid, a heavy 19th-century French mechanical cryptex interwoven with a modern, military-grade biometric and digital failsafe. Inside it lay a hard drive containing the access keys to $3.2 billion in untraceable offshore accounts, and more importantly, the physical ledgers of Sterling Logistics, the front company shielding Cassius's entire operation from the FBI. He had 48 hours before Special Agent Reynolds initiated a federal raid. If that box didn't open, Cassius wouldn't just lose his fortune, he would lose his freedom, and likely his life, as rival families circled like sharks smelling blood in the water. "I need a status update, Lockwood," Cassius said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that offered no room for negotiation. Dr. Aris Lockwood, a former senior cryptography consultant for Palantir and an ex-NSA analyst, was currently sweating through his $3,000 Tom Ford suit. He was the 25th expert Cassius had brought in. The previous 24, ranging from MIT engineering professors to underground black hat hackers from Eastern Europe, had all walked away with nothing but bruised egos and a stern warning to keep their mouths shut. "Mr. Reed, I've bypassed the digital firewall," Lockwood stammered, his fingers flying across the keyboard of his diagnostic laptop, which was tethered to the cylinder via a bypass cable. "But the mechanical component is completely irrational. The internal algorithm shifts the tumblers every 3 minutes. If you enter the wrong combination, a localized EMP will trigger, wiping the drive, and a vial of thermite will melt the physical ledgers. It's a dead man's switch. There is no mathematical pattern to the tumblers. It's chaos." "I didn't pay you $250,000 for excuses, Aris," Cassius replied, stepping away from the window. "I paid you for a solution. Is it chaos, or are you simply not smart enough to see the design?" Lockwood swallowed hard, wiping his brow with a trembling hand. "I'm telling you, it's impenetrable. The 5 brass rings are engraved with letters, but they don't spell anything in any known language. The digital keypad requires a 3-digit input, but without knowing the exact variable of the mechanical shift, it's suicide to guess. I cannot open it." Cassius stared at the man for a long, suffocating moment. Then he sighed, a sound completely devoid of empathy. He nodded to his right-hand man, Matteo, who had been standing silently by the door. "Get him out of my sight," Cassius ordered. "Wait, Mr. Reed. My fee? You'll be paid for your silence, not your success. Leave before I change my mind about how to ensure it," Cassius warned. As Matteo escorted the terrified expert out of the study, Cassius slammed his fist onto the desk. The heavy oak shuddered. 25 experts, the best money could buy, and none of them could crack a box designed by a dead man. He poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan 25, downed it in one fluid motion, and walked out onto the covered balcony to clear his head, leaving the study doors slightly ajar. A few minutes later, Hazel Brooks pushed her heavy cleaning cart down the plush, carpeted hallway of the penthouse. At 23, Hazel was a ghost in this luxurious world. Dressed in a drab grey uniform that hid her slender frame, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, she existed solely to erase the messes of the ultra-rich. Her hands, rough and slightly scarred from industrial cleaning chemicals, belied a past that felt like a distant, painful dream. 3 years ago, Hazel had been a prodigy on a full scholarship at the Juilliard School, studying classical piano. She possessed a rare neurological trait, chromesthesia, a form of synesthesia where she saw sound as vivid colors and felt rhythms as physical textures. But when her mother died suddenly, her father completely unraveled. He turned to the bottle, and then to the underground gambling dens of Chicago. He racked up a 6-figure debt to a brutal loan shark named Rossi. To save her father from having his legs broken, or worse, Hazel dropped out, surrendered her dreams, and took on 3 exhausting jobs. This cleaning position at the elite residential tower was arranged by the agency Rossi forced her to work for, funneling 80% of her meager paycheck directly to his collectors. She kept her head down, spoke to no one, and scrubbed floors until her knees bled. Pushing her cart into the opulent study, Hazel assumed the room was empty. The lights were dim, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass and the faint, peculiar ticking coming from the desk. She approached the mahogany desk, pulling a microfiber cloth from her apron. She was meticulous, knowing that a single speck of dust left behind could cost her the job. But as she wiped down the edges of the desk, her attention was drawn to the besom cylinder. It was an ugly, brutalist thing made of dark metal and brass. But it wasn't its appearance that caught her attention. It was the sound. Tick, tick, tick. Pause. Tick. To Dr. Lockwood and the 24 geniuses before him, it was the sound of a randomized internal clock shifting mechanical tumblers. But to Hazel, the sound wasn't math. It wasn't an algorithm. It was a tempo. She paused, closing her eyes. In the darkness of her mind, the faint, high-pitched hum of the electronic failsafe bled into a vibrant azure blue. The heavy metallic thunk of the tumblers shifting painted streaks of deep crimson. The sounds weren't random. They were forming a distinct, syncopated rhythm. It's an inverted time signature, she thought, her brow furrowing in confusion. Why would a safe be playing a waltz? Hazel opened her eyes and leaned closer to the device. The 5 brass rings on the cylinder weren't engraved with a standard alphabet. They featured only the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Musical notes. She looked at the digital keypad next to the cylinder. The experts had assumed it was a secondary security layer requiring a PIN code. But Hazel's trained mind, instinctively connecting the auditory cues to her visual world, saw the complete picture. The machine was out of tune. The internal gears were grinding because they were trying to resolve a chord progression that was left unfinished. It was Bach. Specifically, a dark, dissonant variation of the well-tempered clavier. Hazel forgot where she was. She forgot about the ruthless men who owned this penthouse. The overwhelming compulsion of a musician to correct a discordant note took over her entire being. She set her feather duster down. Her rough, calloused fingers hovered over the cold brass rings. The bass line resolves in E minor, she whispered to herself. She turned the first dial to E, the second to G, the third to B, the fourth to D, the fifth to F. The faint, painful grinding inside the machine smoothed out into a perfect, harmonious purr. The colors in her mind shifted from angry reds to a calming, crystalline silver. But the red LED light on the digital keypad was still blinking. The tempo. The machine needed the exact beats per minute, BPM, of the piece to synchronize the digital release with the mechanical tumblers. She tapped her foot lightly, feeling the rhythm of the internal clock. 1 and 2 and 3. She reached out to the keypad and typed 108. She pressed the pound key. For a terrifying second, the room went completely silent. The ticking stopped. The hum died. Then, with a heavy, pneumatic hiss, the titanium seals of the beton cylinder retracted. The top popped open, revealing the velvet-lined interior, the glowing hard drive, and a thick stack of leather-bound ledgers. Hazel gasped, suddenly snapping out of her trance. Panic flooded her veins as the reality of what she had just done crashed down upon her. She had tampered with the private property of a billionaire. She stumbled backward, bumping into her cleaning cart, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "What the hell did you just do?" The voice was like a whip cracking in the quiet room. Hazel spun around. Cassius Reed was standing in the doorway, leading to the balcony, his dark coat damp from the rain, his piercing grey eyes locked onto the open cylinder. For the first time in his life, the impenetrable Mafia boss was utterly, completely speechless. He moved across the room with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Hazel shrank back, terrified, but he didn't even look at her at first. He stared into the open box, seeing the glowing green light of the intact hard drive. No EMP, no thermite. The impossible puzzle, the one that had defeated the greatest minds in the country, was open. Cassius slowly turned his gaze to the trembling girl in the grey maid's uniform. His mind raced. Was she an undercover Fed? An assassin sent by the Colombo family? A corporate spy masquerading as the help? He reached out, his large, powerful hand wrapping around her slender wrist like a vice. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Nobody!" Hazel cried out, wincing at his grip. "Please let me go. I'm just the cleaning lady, I swear to God." "Don't lie to me," Cassius growled, pulling her an inch closer. 25 of the smartest experts on the eastern seaboard couldn't crack that. Palantir engineers couldn't crack that. You walk in with a feather duster and open it in 30 seconds. Who do you work for? "I don't work for anyone. It was out of tune," she yelled, tears welling in her eyes. Cassius froze. The sheer absurdity of her statement broke his aggressive momentum. He loosened his grip slightly, though he didn't let her go. "What did you just say?" It was out of tune," Hazel repeated, her voice shaking violently. She pointed a trembling finger at the device. "The letters aren't a password, they're a chord, a minor ninth, and the keypad, it isn't a pin code, it's a metronome setting. 108 beats per minute. I couldn't stand the sound of it grinding. I just wanted to fix the chord." "Please, I'm sorry, I won't tell anyone what I saw." Cassius stared at her, absorbing the information. His late predecessor, the man who built the box, had been a classical music fanatic, a detail none of the tech experts had known, and a detail Cassius had deemed irrelevant. He let go of her wrist, taking a step back. He looked at Hazel, really looked at her for the first time. Beneath the oversized, shapeless uniform and the exhaustion bruising her eyes, there was a sharp, undeniable intelligence. "You're a musician," he stated, the hostility in his tone replaced by a cautious curiosity. "I was," Hazel whispered, rubbing her wrist. "A long time ago." "Please, Mr. Reed, if I lose this job, my father, I can't lose this job." Cassius didn't reply immediately. He reached into the open cylinder to retrieve the hard drive that would save his empire. But as he pulled the drive out, his fingers brushed against something else hidden beneath the velvet lining. A false bottom had sprung open, along with the main lock. Frowning, Cassius reached in and pulled out a faded Polaroid photograph. He looked at the image, his blood running cold. "What is your name?" Cassius asked, his voice suddenly hollow, never taking his eyes off the photograph. "Hazel. Hazel Brooks." Cassius slowly turned the photograph around so she could see it. The picture showed two men standing in front of a familiar Chicago jazz club, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, laughing. One was Cassius's predecessor, the former head of the syndicate. The other man, looking decades younger, vibrant and holding a saxophone, was Hazel's father. "Tell me, Hazel Brooks," Cassius murmured, the air in the room suddenly growing suffocatingly thick. "Why is my uncle posing with your father?" Hazel stared at the photograph, the color draining entirely from her face. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The loan shark, the crippling debt, her father's absolute refusal to talk about his past. The pieces clicked together in her mind, forming a picture far more terrifying than any uncrackable safe. She hadn't just accidentally opened a box. She had just unlocked a ghost from her family's past, and she was now standing face to face with the most dangerous man in Chicago. The photograph felt heavier than lead in Cassius's hand. The ambient noise of the Chicago storm raging outside the soundproof glass faded into a dull, white hum. He stared down at Hazel, his sharp grey eyes searching her exhausted face for any trace of deception. There was none. Only raw, unadulterated terror. "My father," Hazel whispered, her voice barely carrying over the steady drumming of the rain. "Arthur Brooks. He was a jazz musician, a saxophonist at the Green Mill. That's where he played." Cassius slowly placed the Polaroid on the mahogany desk next to the open Besson cylinder. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the heavy gold of his Patek Philippe Nautilus catching the dim light. "My uncle, Dominic Reed, owned the Green Mill back in the 90s. It was the only clean asset he ever possessed. He loved the music, but he didn't make friends with civilians, ever." "I don't know your uncle," Hazel said, backing up until her spine hit the edge of her cleaning cart. "My father never talked about his past. Not until my mother died. Then he broke. He started drinking. Then the gambling started. He owes a man named Rossi over $400,000. Rossi forced me into this cleaning agency to garnish my wages." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. Cassius went perfectly still. "Dominic Rossi," Cassius stated, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. Hazel nodded frantically. "Yes, Dominic Rossi. Please, Mr. Reed, if Rossi finds out I looked inside this box, or if he thinks I messed up this job, he's going to kill my father. He's already threatened to break his hands." A dark, terrifying chuckle rumbled in Cassius's chest. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the sound of a predator realizing the trap had been set from the inside. He turned away from her, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling window. "Rossi is a capo regime in my organization," Cassius said softly, looking out at the glittering, rain-slicked city. "He oversees the South Side gambling operations. He's supposed to be kicking up 30% of his earnings to me. But the numbers haven't matched up in 2 years." Cassius turned back, his gaze locking onto the leather-bound ledgers resting inside the cylinder. He reached in and pulled the heavy book out, flipping it open. He frowned. He flipped another page, then another. He spun the book around and slammed it onto the desk in front of Hazel. "Look at this. Tell me what you see." Hazel flinched but stepped forward, her eyes scanning the yellowed parchment. Her breath hitched. The pages weren't filled with names, dates, or dollar amounts. They were filled entirely with handwritten staff lines, clefs, and complex musical notation. It's a score," Hazel murmured, leaning closer. "A massive symphony. But the phrasing is completely erratic. The time signatures change every 2 measures, and the accidentals don't make any harmonic sense. It's unplayable. It's a cipher," Cassius realized, the pieces violently clicking together in his mind. My uncle didn't just hide the digital access keys. He encrypted the physical ledger of every corrupt politician, judge, and police commissioner on our payroll. And he used a musical code to do it. He looked at Hazel. The grey maid's uniform suddenly seemed like a ridiculous disguise for the brilliant mind standing before him. "Your father didn't just play saxophone for my uncle. He helped him build this code. That's why Rossi has been bleeding your father dry. Rossi knows Arthur holds the key to the cipher. Rossi wants the ledger to overthrow me." Hazel felt her knees buckle. The world she knew, the scrubbing of marble floors, the smell of industrial bleach, the constant, suffocating weight of poverty, was being ripped away, replaced by a deadly conspiracy involving billions of dollars. Cassius caught her by the elbow before she could hit the floor. His grip was entirely different this time. It wasn't a vice. It was an anchor. His large, warm hand steadied her, sending an unexpected jolt of electricity up her arm. "Breathe, Hazel," he commanded, his voice dropping into a low, soothing cadence that contrasted wildly with the danger in his eyes. "You are no longer a maid in this building. As of this exact second, you are under my personal protection. But I need you to translate this ledger." I need to get my father," Hazel stammered, looking up into his imposing face. The proximity was dizzying. She could smell the expensive scotch on his breath, mixed with the sharp scent of cedar and rain. "If Rossi finds out you opened the cylinder, he'll know the endgame is here. He'll execute my father." "Matteo!" Cassius barked. The heavy oak doors of the study flew open, and Cassius's second-in-command stepped in, hand hovering near the lapel of his tailored suit. "Get a tactical team to Arthur Brooks's residence immediately," Cassius ordered, grabbing a sleek, black Kevlar vest from a hidden compartment behind his desk. He tossed a heavy, matte black Beretta, 92 FS, onto the mahogany wood. "Rossi is making a move. We intercept." Matteo pressed an earpiece deep into his ear, listening intently for a few seconds. His face drained of color. "Boss, we're too late. The wiretap on Rossi's burner just pinged. He sent a cleanup crew to Brooks's apartment 10 minutes ago. They're extracting him now, taking him to the old rail yards." Cassius slammed the magazine into his Beretta with a deafening clack. He looked at Hazel, seeing the tears finally spill over her eyelashes. "Come with me," Cassius said, his voice stripped of all its corporate veneer, leaving only the ruthless street boss beneath. "We are going to get him back." The midnight black Aston Martin DBS tore through the flooded streets of Chicago like a phantom, its V12 engine roaring a terrifying, aggressive melody. Hazel sat in the passenger seat, gripping the leather armrest so tightly her knuckles were translucent. Cassius drove with one hand on the wheel, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. "Stay in the car when we arrive," Cassius ordered, as they swerved violently off the main road, tearing through a rusted chain-link fence that marked the entrance to the abandoned rail yards. "The glass is bulletproof. Do not open the doors for anyone but me. Do you understand?" "I'm not leaving him in there alone," Hazel fired back, her voice shaking, but laced with a sudden, desperate defiance. Cassius slammed on the brakes, the Aston Martin skidding to a halt behind a towering stack of rusted shipping containers. He turned to her, his hand reaching out to cup her face. His thumb brushed a stray tear from her cheek, his touch calloused but shockingly gentle. "I will not let anything happen to him, Hazel. I swear it on my life," Cassius said softly, his eyes boring into hers. The raw intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. In that fleeting second, amidst the rain and the impending violence, a profound shift occurred between them. The billionaire Mafia boss and the indebted Maid ceased to exist. There was only a man stepping into the dark to protect the woman who had just saved his empire. Cassius stepped out of the car into the torrential downpour. Matteo and 3 other heavily armed men emerged from an SUV that had followed closely behind. They moved with lethal, synchronized precision toward a dilapidated warehouse illuminated by the harsh glare of halogen work lights. Hazel watched through the rain-streaked window, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm in her chest. She couldn't sit there. The chromesthesia in her mind was going wild, flashes of violent crimson and jagged black streaks matching the impending gunfire. Inside the warehouse, Dominic Rossi stood over a battered, bloody Arthur Brooks, who was tied to a metal folding chair. Rossi, a thick-necked man with a scarred jaw, sneered as he held up a pair of heavy bolt cutters. "Last chance, old man," Rossi spat. "Give me the musical key to the ledger, and I let your daughter live. Keep playing dumb, and I'll have my boys pay Hazel a visit at that fancy penthouse she cleans." Arthur, his face swollen and bruised, managed a defiant, bloody smile. "You don't get it, Dom. The cipher requires a perfect pitch. It requires a mind that sees the music. I don't have the key. She does." Before Rossi could process the statement, the heavy, corrugated metal doors of the warehouse blew inward with a deafening explosion. Smoke and rain poured into the space. Cassius emerged from the smoke like a demon summoned from the abyss. He didn't hesitate. He didn't monologue. He raised his beretta, and the warehouse erupted into a symphony of gunfire. Hazel, having cracked her car door open against Cassius's orders, clamped her hands over her ears. To her, the gunshots weren't just noise. They were blinding flashes of pure, agonizing white light in her mind. Within 45 seconds, the chaotic staccato of gunfire ceased. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, save for the rain. Hazel stumbled out of the Aston Martin, sprinting toward the warehouse. She burst through the ruined doors. Rossi's men were scattered across the concrete floor, incapacitated. Cassius stood over Rossi, his polished Oxford shoe planted firmly on the traitor's chest, the barrel of his gun aimed squarely at Rossi's forehead. "Cassius, wait!" Rossi choked out, blood spilling from a wound in his shoulder. "I was doing it for the family. The old man was holding out on us." "You threatened what is mine," Cassius said, his voice dead and devoid of mercy. He pulled the trigger. The crack echoed through the cavernous space. "Dad!" Hazel screamed, rushing past the carnage and throwing herself onto her father's battered form. She frantically untied the thick ropes binding his wrists. Arthur coughed, wrapping his trembling arms around his daughter. He looked up over her shoulder, his eyes locking onto Cassius, who was slowly lowering his weapon. The ruthless killer, standing amidst the bodies, looked exactly like the man Arthur had loved like a brother 30 years ago. "You're Dominic's boy," Arthur wheezed, managing a weak smile. Cassius walked over, holstering his weapon. He looked down at the old jazz musician, then at Hazel, who was clutching her father as if he were her lifeline. Cassius knelt down on the bloody concrete, completely ignoring the ruin of his expensive suit. "Your debt is erased, Arthur," Cassius said firmly. "Rossi's accounts will be liquidated, and the money will be transferred to you. You and your daughter will never have to look over your shoulders again." Hazel looked up at Cassius, her eyes wide with disbelief. The terrifying, cold Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who had just risked his life and his empire to protect her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Cassius reached out, his fingers gently tracing the rough, chemical-burned scars on Hazel's hands. He looked at her with an intensity that made the rest of the world melt away. "You're never touching a bottle of bleach again, Hazel," Cassius murmured, his thumb stroking her palm. "Tomorrow, I'm having a grand Steinway, moved into the penthouse, and you are going to help me run this city." The rain stopped, leaving the Chicago skyline glittering like scattered diamonds. Hazel stood by the penthouse glass, her fingers resting on the cool Steinway keys. She was no longer a maid erasing messes. She was the queen of an empire, holding the heart of its most dangerous king. Cassius wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close, their once chaotic symphony finally finding its perfect, unbreakable chord.